The Hindu Kush mountains are a brutal, unforgiving place. Jagged peaks stab at the sky, their stone faces scarred by wind and ice. It's a land that doesn't care if you live or die. Up here, survival is a minute-by-minute battle. Our outpost, Alpha 7, was just a tiny speck clinging to the side of one of these giants. It was a collection of sand-colored containers and sandbags, a fragile human footprint in a world of rock and snow. The wind howled constantly, a relentless assault on our senses trying to peel us right off the mountain. This wasn't just a military posting, this was the edge of the known world, a place where the air is thin and help is a very, very long way away. My team was a small one, just 4 of us. We had to rely on each other for everything. I'm Sergeant Marcus Chen. My job was to keep these men alive. Then there was Corporal Liam Doc O'Connell, our medic. He was a steady hand from Boston, someone who could patch you up and tell a bad joke to take your mind off the pain. Specialist Jake Sparks Peterson was our communications expert, a young kid from Idaho who could work miracles with a radio, or so we thought. Finally, there was Private First Class David Rook Miller, the youngest of our group, strong as an ox but still learning the ropes. We were a tight unit, a family forged by isolation and the shared danger of this incredible landscape. The outpost itself was a fortress against the elements, but it felt more like a cage. The walls were lined with HESCO barriers, giant wire mesh boxes filled with sand and rock. A watchtower stood at one corner, its lonely eyes scanning the vast, empty valleys below. Inside, our living quarters were cramped, smelling of diesel fuel, stale coffee, and cold metal. Everything was practical, stripped down to the bare essentials for survival. We had a generator for power, a comms tent for our lifeline to the outside world, and a small mess area. But outside those thin metal walls, the mountains watched, ancient and immense, reminding us just how small and vulnerable we truly were. Living at Alpha 7 meant accepting that the environment was your primary enemy. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that seeped through every layer of clothing and settled deep in your bones. At over 10,000 feet, every breath was an effort, a sharp reminder of the thin atmosphere. We moved slowly, deliberately, conserving energy because you never knew when you'd need it. The landscape was beautiful in a terrifying way, a panorama of silent snow-covered peaks that stretched to the horizon. But that beauty hid 1,000 dangers, from sudden rockfalls to the dizzying drops just feet from our perimeter. We were intruders here, and the mountain never let us forget it. Our days at Alpha 7 followed a strict, repetitive rhythm. Survival depends on routine. You do the same things at the same time every single day. It keeps you sharp and stops you from making stupid mistakes. The day began before dawn, with the roar of the diesel generator kicking to life, fighting against the profound silence of the mountains. We'd check the perimeter, our boots crunching on the frozen ground. We'd inspect our gear, clean our weapons, and force down some hot food. Every task, no matter how small, was crucial. A forgotten check, a loose strap, out here those little things could get you killed. The monotony was a tool, a shield against the crushing isolation. The cold was our constant companion. It was more than just a temperature, it was a force of nature that dictated our every move. You couldn't escape it. It crept into our sleeping bags at night and greeted us with an icy slap in the morning. We wore layers upon layers of gear, but the chill always found a way in. Water would freeze in our canteens if we weren't careful. Metal tools felt like they could burn your skin right off with their coldness. We spent hours huddled around the small heater in the mess tent, sipping coffee, the steam from our mugs, the only real warmth we felt all day. This environment drains your will to live if you let it. Boredom was another enemy we had to fight. When you're stuck in a tiny box on top of the world, your mind can start to play tricks on you. We did what we could to keep it at bay. Rook would lift makeshift weights made from ammo cans and scrap metal. Doc would read worn-out paperbacks, their covers soft from being passed around so many times. Sparks would tinker with his electronics, always trying to boost a signal or fix some piece of gear. I'd study maps of the surrounding terrain, trying to burn every ridge and valley into my memory. We talked, we argued, we played cards, anything to fill the vast, empty hours and remind ourselves we were still human. The isolation was the hardest part. Sometimes, days would go by without a single word from command. We were completely alone, a tiny island of humanity in an ocean of rock and sky. The silence between radio checks was immense, a heavy blanket that could feel peaceful one moment and suffocating the next. We'd stare out at the mountains, watching the sun crawl across the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the valleys. It was a humbling experience, seeing that raw, untamed power. It made you feel incredibly small, a temporary visitor in a place that would be here long after you were gone. That kind of solitude changes a man.
It started with the radio. Sparks was the first to notice it. He was our link to the outside world, and he knew his equipment better than he knew himself. At first, it was just a faint crackle on the long-range frequency, a little bit of extra static that shouldn't have been there. He dismissed it as atmospheric interference, a common problem in these mountains. The rock and weather could play hell with radio waves. He'd spend hours tuning the dials, trying to clean up the signal, his brow furrowed in concentration. But this was different. This static had a strange quality, a rhythm that felt unnatural. It wasn't just random noise. Over the next few days, the interference grew worse. It started to bleed into our short-range comms, making routine check-ins with each other a chore. The static would rise and fall, sometimes sounding like a distant whisper just beyond the edge of hearing. Sparks became obsessed. He checked every wire, every antenna, every power source. He was convinced it was an equipment malfunction, a logical problem with a logical solution. But no matter what he did, the noise remained, a persistent, unnerving presence on the airwaves. It was like the mountain itself was trying to talk to us, and we couldn't understand what it was saying.
Then the whispers became clearer. It was during a long, quiet night watch when Rook first heard it. He called me on the radio, his voice trembling. He said he could hear voices in the static, faint and distorted, speaking a language he didn't recognize. I told him it was his mind playing tricks on him, a combination of exhaustion and the hypnotic hiss of the radio. But then Doc heard it too, and so did I. It was a chorus of faint, overlapping whispers, a chilling sound that seemed to ride the waves of static. It was impossible, but it was happening. The sound was ancient, guttural, and filled with a sense of deep despair.
The team's mood began to shift. The radio, our only connection to safety and home, had become a source of fear. Sparks stopped trying to explain it away. He would just sit there in his comms tent, listening for hours, a look of dread on his young face. The whispers were not constant. They would come and go, fading in and out with the static, sometimes disappearing for a whole day, only to return louder and more disturbing the next night. It felt like something was out there in the vast emptiness, something ancient and malevolent, and it was using our own technology to reach us, to slowly drive us mad. The psychological pressure was immense. We were soldiers, trained to handle threats we could see and fight, but this was different. This was a psychological war, an invisible enemy that was inside our heads, in our dreams, and on our radios. The cracks in our courage were starting to show, and I was terrified they would break us completely. The feeling of being watched became constant. It was a heavy, oppressive sensation, like a physical weight on our shoulders. During patrols around the perimeter, the silence of the mountains no longer felt peaceful. It felt menacing, full of unseen eyes. The wind whistling through the rocks sounded like whispers. The shadow of a passing cloud looked like a figure darting between boulders. Fear is a corrosive thing. It started to eat away at our team's unity. Rook, the youngest, became jumpy and paranoid. He would stare out into the darkness for hours, convinced he was seeing movement in the rocks. His fear was contagious, and soon we were all seeing things that weren't there. Sparks grew withdrawn and quiet, spending all his time in the comms tent, talking to himself as he worked. Doc tried to keep our spirits up with his usual humor, but his jokes fell flat, his eyes betraying a deep-seated anxiety he couldn't hide. I did my best to hold them together, to be the strong leader, but even I felt the dread gnawing at my gut. Doc, our medic, tried to rationalize it as a group stress reaction. He said the isolation and the radio noises were getting to us, but the shared details of our dreams were too specific to be a coincidence. Then came the nightmares. One by one we each started having them. They were all terrifyingly similar. We dreamed of being lost in the snow, freezing and alone, hunted by something we could never quite see. We'd see dark, fleeting shapes at the edge of our vision, hear the same guttural whispers from the radio, but this time they were right behind us. We'd wake up in a cold sweat, our hearts pounding, the thin air in the barracks feeling thick and suffocating. The strange occurrences were no longer confined to the radio. Our equipment, usually reliable, began to fail in bizarre ways. The generator would sputter and die for no reason, plunging us into sudden, shocking darkness and silence before roaring back to life a few minutes later. The batteries in our night vision goggles would drain in a matter of minutes, leaving us blind during our watch rotations. Sparks was run ragged trying to diagnose a dozen different problems at once. He insisted it was the extreme cold combined with a faulty power regulator, but his explanations started to sound hollow, even to himself. The outpost was becoming unreliable, our fragile bubble of technology failing us. A cold dread settled over us, far colder than the mountain air. We weren't the first. There had been another team here, a team that Command had never mentioned. They had faced the same invisible enemy and had vanished without a trace, their existence buried under snow and silence. We were reliving their last days, following in their footsteps towards some unknown, terrifying fate. The official record showed Alpha 7 being established with our arrival. It was a lie. We were not pioneers. We were replacements for a team that had been erased, and whatever had taken them was now coming for us. The mystery of the whispers suddenly had a horrifying context. Sparks grabbed the broken radio, his hands shaking as he examined it. He said it was a model that had been phased out a couple of years ago, but the most chilling discovery came from the journal. The pages were stiff with ice, the ink smeared and faded, but we could make out some of the entries. The last few pages were a frantic scrawl. The writer, a sergeant just like me, described the same things we were experiencing. The strange radio whispers, the equipment failures, the nightmares. He wrote about a growing, paralyzing fear, a sense of being hunted by the mountain itself. The final entry was short and barely legible. It's in the sound. Don't listen. God help us. As Doc gently pried the frozen pages of the album apart, we saw the faces of 4 other soldiers smiling and posing in front of our very own outpost. Their uniforms were a slightly older pattern. They looked so young, so full of life. It was like looking at ghosts. I carefully dug it out of the frozen earth, the canvas stiff and cold in my hands. It felt heavy, like a relic from a forgotten time, holding secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I brought the rucksack back to the main tent and called the team together. The mood was tense as I placed the frozen bag on the table. It was like an artifact from a tomb. With a knife, I carefully cut the frozen buckles and straps. Inside, the contents were mostly preserved by the cold. There was a waterlogged journal, a broken shortwave radio, and a small leather-bound photo album. It was during a routine perimeter check that I found it. A recent rock slide had shifted a large bank of snow and shale about 100 yards from the outpost's western edge. Half buried in the newly exposed debris was a faded green rucksack, the same type we used. It was old, weathered, and partially torn, but it was definitely military issue. My heart pounded in my chest. We were the only unit assigned to this sector. There shouldn't have been any other gear out here. The discovery of the rucksack shattered any remaining hope that we were just imagining things. The threat was real. It had a history.
I gathered the team, my voice steady despite the fear coiling in my stomach. We stick together, I said. We work the problem. We find a way out of this. Our mission was no longer just to man an outpost. It was to survive.
We had to understand what happened to the previous team if we were to avoid the same fate. We divided the tasks. Doc would continue to carefully thaw and decipher the journal, looking for any clue, any detail that might help us. His medical training made him patient and meticulous, perfect for the job.
Sparks and I turned our attention to the official records. We spent hours in the comms tent, digging through every digital file and log we had access to. We were looking for any mention of a previous unit, any report of unusual activity, any gap in the timeline that might suggest a cover-up.
The official story was seamless. According to Command, this patch of rock was empty before we arrived, but the rucksack proved that was a lie. It was like searching for a ghost in a machine. Every query came back negative, every search returned nothing. It was as if the previous team had been wiped from history, their very existence scrubbed clean. This only deepened our fear.
Meanwhile, Rook and Doc worked on the physical evidence. Doc managed to dry out more pages of the journal. The entries became more erratic, more desperate. The sergeant wrote about a song in the static, a sound that unraveled the mind. He mentioned his men becoming violent and paranoid, turning on each other. He described trying to destroy their radio to make it stop, but the sound was already inside their heads.
Rook, using his strength, carefully sifted through the remaining contents of the rucksack, finding a small carved stone totem, its shape alien and unsettling. It felt ancient and cold to the touch, a relic of something that had no place here.
As we worked, the atmosphere in the outpost grew heavier. We felt like we were in a race against time, with the whispers on the radio as the ticking clock. We started cross-referencing the journal with our own experiences. The generator failures, the draining batteries, the shared nightmares, it was all there in the faded ink. We weren't just experiencing similar events, we were living an exact echo of the past.
The previous team had been here for about 3 weeks before they vanished. We checked our own calendar. We were on day 19. The realization hit us like a physical blow. We had only a few days left before we reached the same point in the pattern. The search for answers had become a countdown to our own disappearance.
We gathered in the mess tent, our weapons cleaned and ready, our faces grim. We didn't know what we were fighting, but we knew it was coming. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, a solid wall of black that seemed to press in on us. The outpost felt smaller than ever, a tiny, fragile bubble of light in an endless, hungry night. We just sat there, waiting, listening to the frantic beating of our own hearts. As the sun set on our 21st day, a deep, unnatural quiet fell over the mountain. The constant wind died down completely, and the silence was deafening. It was the calm before the storm. We all knew it. Sparks, who had once been the master of his domain in the comms tent, now refused to go in there alone. He said the sound was trying to talk to him directly, promising him things, trying to convince him to let it in. He looked gaunt and haunted, his eyes wide with a terror that I couldn't fix with orders or encouragement. The whispers on the radio changed. They were no longer just faint guttural noises mixed with static. They were becoming clearer, closer. Sometimes we could hear what sounded like a twisted mockery of our own voices, repeating fragments of our conversations from earlier in the day. Doc claimed he saw a tall, gaunt figure standing on a distant ridge, watching the outpost, only for it to vanish when he looked through his binoculars. We were all on edge, our nerves frayed to the point of breaking. Sleep offered no escape, only the same recurring nightmares, which were now more vivid, more terrifying than ever before. The feeling of being watched intensified tenfold. It was no longer just a vague sense of unease. Now we could almost feel the pressure of its gaze. When the wind howled, we heard our names being called. In the deep shadows cast by the rocks, we saw movement that was too quick, too unnatural to be an animal. Rook began barricading the door to our barracks every night with spare equipment, a futile gesture against an enemy that could get inside our heads. The outpost, once a shelter, now felt like a trap we had built for ourselves. We stopped talking about anything but the threat. All jokes ceased. Every conversation was about defenses, escape plans, and the whispers that never fully went away. The fear was now a living thing among us. It sat with us at meals. It stood over us as we slept, and it walked with us on patrol. The knowledge that we were on a timer, that we were following a script written by a dead team, was a heavy burden.
The end began with a sound we had come to dread, the dying groan of the generator. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. We were plunged into total darkness, the emergency backup lights failing to kick in. The sudden silence was a physical shock, broken only by Rook's sharp intake of breath.
For a moment, nobody moved. Then, the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from all around us. They came from the corners of the room, from outside the thin metal walls, from right beside our ears. They were loud, clear, and filled with a chilling ancient hatred. It was the sound from our nightmares, made real.
Chaos erupted. Rook screamed, firing his rifle blindly into the darkness of the barracks, yelling that they were in the room with us. Doc tackled him, trying to wrestle the weapon away before he shot one of us.
Sparks, completely broken, scrambled for the comms tent, screaming that he had to send a warning, that he had to tell them what the sound was. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting a frantic, narrow path through the blackness. The air grew impossibly cold, our breath misting in the beam of light. The whispers grew into a cacophony, a maddening chorus of overlapping voices that clawed at our sanity.
I got to the comms tent right behind Sparks. He was frantically trying to power up the radio with the emergency hand-crank generator, his movements clumsy with panic. The whispers were loudest in here, seeming to emanate directly from the speakers of the silent equipment.
It's the sound! It travels on the signal! He shrieked at me, his eyes wild. They used the radio to get a foothold, and now they're here!
Outside, I heard a sickening thud, followed by a scream from Doc that was cut short. Then an awful, profound silence from that direction. Rook had gone quiet too.
I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the soul, that I was alone with Sparks. The whispers focused on me, calling my name, promising an end to the cold and the fear. The voice was hypnotic, calming, trying to lull me into dropping my guard.
I saw Sparks stop cranking. He turned to me, a strange, empty smile on his face. "It's so quiet now, Sarge," he whispered, but the voice wasn't his own. It was deeper, older.
Before I could react, he lunged not at me but at the radio, smashing the delicate equipment with his fists, destroying our only hope of sending a detailed warning. Then he turned and walked calmly out of the tent, into the oppressive darkness, disappearing as if he was never there. I was alone. The chaos had ended as quickly as it began, replaced by a silence more terrifying than any noise. The whispers were gone, but their memory echoed in my mind. My team was gone. Doc, Rook, Sparks, vanished into the night, consumed by the same unknown horror that took the team before us. I stood frozen in the wrecked comms tent, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. The cold was absolute, a physical entity that was stealing the warmth from my body. Survival instinct, the one thing that had been drilled into me for years, finally took over. I had to warn them. I had to make sure no one else was ever sent to this cursed place. I salvaged what I could. The main transmitter was destroyed, smashed beyond repair by Sparks, but the small emergency beacon, a simple device with a preset distress frequency, was still intact. It didn't have the power to send a voice transmission, only a simple, repeating signal. A cry for help. It was better than nothing. My fingers were numb, clumsy with cold and fear, but I managed to connect it to the hand-cranked generator. I began to crank, the rhythmic motion a small anchor in a sea of insanity. With every turn I sent a tiny pulse of energy out into the void, a desperate SOS from the edge of the world. As I cranked, I grabbed the dead radio's microphone, pressing the transmit button out of pure, desperate habit. I knew it was useless, that the main unit was dead, but I had to try. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "This is Sergeant Marcus Chen, Outpost Alpha 7, they're all gone, the whole team is gone." I paused, listening to the profound silence. It's the sound, something in the signal. It comes through the radio. It gets in your head. Tell command. Do not listen. Do not respond. Abandon this post. Erase it from the maps. Stay away from this mountain. I repeated the message over and over, a prayer to a dead machine. Now, I just sit here. The emergency beacon has its own small battery, so it will continue its silent scream for a few more hours. I stopped cranking the generator. My energy is gone. The cold has settled deep into my bones and I can no longer feel my feet. The door to the tent is open, showing only a wall of impenetrable blackness. The silence of the Hindu Kush has returned, but it is no longer empty. I can feel it watching me, waiting patiently. I don't know what happened to my men, but I know I am the last one. I have sent the last transmission. And now, I will wait for the silence to take me too.